So I hope to offer a little bit of a glimpse of a little how things could be differently or different. So the system that I'm going to talk about, sociocracy, I want to just make one little connection here, comes from the Netherlands, and it's been developed around the time I was born. So I'm just, I'm just somebody talking about it. I had no contribution in making it, and I'm in awe because it's a really smart system. And one little fun fact on that, since we've been talking about unions, is the following thing. So, as we all know, right, in Europe, unions are a little stronger than in this country. And by the way, I'm from Europe myself. And one one aspect of that is that in the Netherlands, where sociocracy comes from, companies that, given their size, would need to, like, would be required legally to have a union, don't have to do that. They explicitly exempt if they're sociocratic, because the logic of sociocratic organizations is that the workers don't need representations because they are the decision makers already. So we don't need that external adjustment or somewhat internal kind of the patch, right? Because we've already set it up in a way so that the workers are it. That is who's running it. So one, I guess, overarching kind of to give you a little glimpse in what we're trying to do with sociocracy is just a little metaphor. So we use the metaphor of water, which actually I stole from somewhere completely different and from the Soul of Money, I think. But so if you have a lot of water in one big blob, right, and you keep it just there, it's typically going to go bad, right? And that's what happens if you have a lot of centralization of power, right? And what we're trying to do in sociocracy is to have like an irrigation system, right? That kind of takes the water and puts it places and kind of moves it along into many places so a lot of things can grow. So we're trying to decentralize power and put it into the appropriate places. So and here's how we do that. There's two parts in that. One is the big question of who decides, like where does power go? Who decides about what? And the second one is how do we decide? And as we all know, in hierarchical systems, things tend to be decided by individuals. And here we're trying to shift to a more collaborative power by groups. And so I'm going to talk about both of those, the who decides and how do we decide. I'm going to start with how do we decide, just to give you a little bit of an overview of the tool set, just also to see just what's possible. So how we decide is decision making by consent, which is very similar to those of you that are familiar with consensus. It's a little bit of a tweak on it, depending on how you practice it, but I'm not going to go into the super fine details here. The point of consent is if a group makes a decision and they're the decision maker on it, that proposal moves forward if there's no objection, no reason to say no. And the cool thing about that is kind of hits that sweet spot between endless talking, right? Trying to make everybody happy. Like everybody has to be fully on board and even have their extra, like whatever wishes, like the whole wish list on in the proposal. Versus we're just shutting people down and we're not interested in what they even think, right? And so we're in between. We're kind of moving forward if things are good enough. There's no problem, so that means we can go, and then we can learn together. So it all puts us into a learning position together as a team. And by the way, that's also how we decide, for example, who's the leader. I'm the executive director of the organization that I work for, Sociocracy for All, and I was elected into that role by consent. So the people who are the decision makers on that decision, each one needed to give their consent to have me in that role. So I was not just put into that place. I had to, people have to kind of earn the trust of the people that they work with to be in that position. Then there are a few other things that kind of just make life easier to hear people the first time. That's how I typically say it, so that objecting to a proposal doesn't become the first time you ever asked for your opinion. For example, there are little things like we tend to talk in rounds, just one by one in meetings, because that way, whatever proposal we come up with together, we've already co-created. So it's not even a question of checks and balances. I think of it more as creating an ecosystem that is already collective, that is already collaborative, so that we don't need that check at the end. That's just kind of the safety net at the end. Another thing, for example, is that when we plan a meeting, the agenda for that meeting requires consent from everybody present. And a reason to object, for example, would be you again didn't put my topic on the agenda, or no, this takes way too long, or no, this is not actually relevant right now. So people's voice in how they spend their time is taken very seriously, and that's something I personally really like about it. So again, voice and inclusion are really the design principles to make all of that happen. So that's all about how we talk to each other and how we have meetings and how we decide. What's really fascinating is that second topic of who decides what. And the way we do that, think back to the irrigation system, okay? We need all that power, that agency to make things happen, right? As Jeff was saying, or something along those lines. We need it in many different places, wherever people do work. So what we do is we say, okay, who works in this area? Okay, you guys work in this area, you make the decision on that area. It sounds ridiculously simple, but that's how it's done. So in kind of sociocracy jargon, that means we have the domains, so those are the areas of decision making, and everybody who works in that domain tends to be a decision maker on that with a little bit of refinement. And then we have subsets of that. So for example, if you have a marketing circle group, a subset of that would be social media, right? A subset of that might be the TikTok team that is doing that. So the TikTok circle would make decisions about TikTok, and nobody can override their decisions, override the decisions. So social media as the next higher circle cannot override a decision that only has to do with TikTok. And that way we really have autonomy and local decision making. And that's one of the key pieces. So circles need to have full decision making power in their domain. Then those circles make decisions and they define roles that they want to have and give those roles to people, all by consent. So we're kind of building our own system of how power gets distributed and how we empower people to do certain things and what we want them to do. And we can change that at any given point in time because it's just our system that we're building for our social media circle. And in that way, as I said earlier about the unions, every worker is a decider somewhere, right, in that area where they work. And it also tends to be, it's not a requirement, but it tends to be that every person has more than one role. Like I have, I don't know, 15 roles or so. So it's not only that I walk around being the executive director all the time. That's actually a small sliver of my time. Most of the time I'm part of, actually social media circle and, this other thing and this other thing. So it happens actually, and that's quite sweet, I find. In some circles, let's say any given person might be in some circle the leader of a circle I'm a part of, while in this other circle, I'm the leader and that person is a part of it, right? So we have these different relationships depending on what hat we're wearing. So that typically makes it less likely that one person becomes like that big shot and has kind of an overbearing amount of power. Um, One other example of just give you a little bit of a taste of what that looks like is we also have a design principle that if you have a circle, like a circle of 5 here and another circle of 5, um, let's say this is social media and this is TikTok, right? So this is a subset here. And now we have two people that are on both circles. And that way we make sure that the higher circle, so to speak, cannot just override the other one on anything. They can make a decision that would be to the disadvantage of that circle because the two people that are also part of that circle, they would absolutely object and say no. Like, no, this is not going to work for TikTok. No way, we can't do it. So any decision has to be made kind of in mutual consent because and in alignment so that everything fits together. And that's how we kind of build from the bottom up a system that stays coherent, at least if people pay attention. So the strength of this is, or the strengths of this system of sociocracy are, it's absolutely doable. One can do it now, right? It's not something in the future, it's something for now. And in fact, there are a bunch of sociocratic organizations. It's not kind of a dream, it's already been done, right? So it's pretty tried and tested already. And it's fairly flexible. Like it's kind of more like a design principle toolbox where you can kind of piece it together. Of course, there are kind of logical ways of doing it and some that are kind of workarounds. Some of the shortfalls I do want to mention because it really applies here is that it's this way of building an organization is really just just, but that's already a lot, but it's still limited to that, a leveling of the playing field, right? Biases still exist. It's still harder for some people to object than for others, right? If you grew up knowing that your voice will be heard, it's going to be easier for you to object than for other people who have not had that experience. So it's a little bit like you take that shell away, right? But the imprint is of course still there, and it needs a whole other set of tools to undo that, or to at least weaken that effect. So I was, for example, listening to the Starbucks incident, right? And I do remember that some vaguely, but that kind of stuff might still happen because that, like, you can't really, with a system like sociocracy at least, you can't really undo that would ever happen. You might change the response of that, but that incident might have still happened the same, because maybe even each Starbucks, whatever they're called, like each of the cafes might have more local autonomy, and then that's just what it is. So I'm just pointing that out because sociocracy, I think, is doing a lot, but it's not doing everything. It's not a magic fix at all. It's kind of a web of other things that need to click together. So it really just applies to that positional power, um, and somewhat to that collective power. So on those levels on the slides. Um, One little comment, because I saw it in the chat. Somebody was wondering about how to start an organization. And there is one book, it's called Who Decides, Who Decides, that is exactly talking about how do you start with a small organization and decentralize and kind of share from the very beginning, so you don't even run into those founder things and all of that stuff.